Monday, everyone. My name is Venezuela Robinson. I serve on the LWV Ohio board and a member of the newly formed Southeast chapter of the LWV of Greater Cleveland. Closed captioning is available by clicking on the CC icon at the bottom of the screen. And today's recorded event will be uploaded to the LVWO website. Our moderator today has been a league member since 2005 and suggests that all league members should feel encouraged to be active in the league. In her professional life, she is a recently retired environmental attorney with experience in teaching and the private practice of law. She is the co-president of the League of Women Voters of Greater Cleveland and a member of the Shaker Heights chapter of that league. Before becoming co-president, she served as vice president and as the coordinator of the league's Greater Cleveland Congressional Redistricting Petition Drive in 2017 and the campaign for the state ballot measure to reform congressional redistricting in 2018. It is my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Catherine LaCroix.
Thank you, Venezuela. And welcome to everyone to today's Lunching with the League. We are very happy to feature our guest today, Representative Bride Rose Sweeney, a true dynamo and an impressive talent in our Ohio General Assembly. But before I introduce her, I want to briefly explain our format. So our speaker will start by sharing some of her thoughts, priorities, and goals for a period of time, and then we will have time for questions from the audience. So please be thinking of questions you want to ask and put your questions in the Q&A box on your screen anytime during our session. We are also moderating the chat, but put your questions there anytime during the session and we'll line them up and I will ask as many questions as I can during the Q&A period before we complete our session, which we are planning to end by 12:45 today. As Venezuela noted, a video of this event will be available on the League of Ohio website after it is over. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Representative Bride Rose Sweeney is a Cleveland native. She serves the people of the 14th Ohio House District, which includes wards 16 and 17 of Cleveland, as well as the suburbs of Brooklyn, Brook Park, Middleburg Heights, and Parma Heights. She is the first woman elected to represent the district, and she is the youngest Democratic member of the 134th General Assembly. Representative Sweeney grew up on the same street on the west side of Cleveland as her grandmother, a first-generation Irish American for whom she is named. She attended St. Joseph Academy and John Carroll University, where she earned her degree in political science, business, and leadership. After college, Representative Sweeney joined Ohio's Legislative Service Commission Fellowship, a competitive public service program that prepares the state's next generation of leaders. Before her election to the Ohio House of Representatives in 2018, she worked in a variety of roles in the Ohio Senate, including as a senior advisor to two different minority leaders and a legislative aide to Senator Lou Gentile, an Appalachian Ohio area Democrat. In the State House, she serves on these following committees: Finance, the Finance Subcommittee on Primary and Secondary Education, Financial Institutions, Government Oversight, and Insurance. Among the bills she is currently sponsoring or co-sponsoring are, and this is the big one, House Bill 1 to create a new school financing system. And then she is also a co-sponsor or sponsor of House Bill 3, Aisha's Law regarding domestic violence, which is of particular interest to those of us from the Shaker Heights area, which is the site of the incident for which the law is named. House Bill 54 to dissolve academic distress commissions, House Bill 55 to allow House committees and sessions to be conducted virtually, House Bill 56 to require face coverings during House committee events and House sessions, House Bill 183 to abolish the death penalty in Ohio, and most recently, House Bill 209, which is legislation to require boards of elections to provide multiple secure ballot drop boxes. So that is a brief introduction to our speaker and the range and scope of her legislative interests. With that, I turn the microphone over to our guest. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you to the entire League of Women Voters for having me before you guys today. I'm always so impressed by your organization and the power of what grass movement, organization and gathering can mean, and even in a pandemic. And we wouldn't have some of the very exciting things, especially with redistricting reform, and hopefully we get to fairer districts because of your organization. And I will always be grateful and just with the ability to have these forums and connecting the people with the lawmakers across the state. So thank you, and thank you for the introduction. I want to spend most of my time on House Bill 1, the school funding formula, fair plan. However, I would love to answer any questions about anything I've worked on in the past or continue to, or if I don't, I'm sure I have an opinion if you want to hear it. But the reason why I want to talk about House Bill 1, I just, and when I tweeted out about this event, there's just no issue that's more important. That doesn't mean that other issues aren't, equally important or less important. When we're talking about educating and the duty for, it's in our Constitution to provide an adequate education to students, no matter where they come from, their zip code, who their parents are, that one of the principles of when, we created the Ohio Constitution, that was in there. And through a variety of different cases, I believe that there was 4 that actually made it to the Ohio Supreme Court case. Supreme Court actually determined that the way that we were funding our schools a few decades ago was unconstitutional for a variety of reasons, it not being adequate. But one of the most important that people often point to is the overreliance on property tax. And you can see that lower wealth income districts have less resources compared to those that are high income. And you actually can see that in the results and the performance of those schools. And that was found to be unconstitutional. For over 24 years since the last Supreme Court case, the General Assembly has tried multiple times, but has never actually looked at reforming the way we actually fund our schools. Most of the fixes have just been Band-Aid fixes. We put caps and guarantees, and basically, as somebody that's a sponsor of this, I can confidently say there is not one person in the state of Ohio that could adequately and confidently explain our current funding situation, why it came to be, and that's a problem. It is, we're talking about education of our entire generations of people for the past 24 years that we actually haven't addressed this problem. When the final lawsuit came out, I was going into kindergarten. So you've had an entire generation and then some knowing that we have a system that is unjust and unfair, and using our tax money without any evidence based. And so with the work of former Representative Patterson, and now actually Speaker Bob Cupp, convened a work group of superintendents and treasurers from urban, suburban, rural districts, low income, high income, and actually created all of these different work groups to look at and actually do the work of creating a new fair funding formula. And that took over 3 years and was the culmination, which is often referred to the Cupp-Patterson plan. It was House Bill 305 last General Assembly. It actually passed out of the House 87-7, which for something that hasn't been done because of, different political issues and, it's very complicated to get to that point where we had 87 members of the Ohio House voting in this, and massive bipartisan push was very exciting, and unfortunately was not able to get it over the finish line. And in Ohio, anything that doesn't get passed within a General Assembly in that biennium will die. And so that's where I come in. Representative Patterson reached out to me at the end of the year and asked me to carry on his torch, one of his legacies, to get this across the finish line. And that's what, I'd love to talk to you just a little bit more in detail. And it can be a little dry, but it's so important because it impacts all of us. If we have kids in schools, if we've been to public schools, it is, completely related and connected to the health of our economy. If, people want to come to Ohio, move to a community, if we want to attract businesses, it's all related. This is the foundation that we've been neglecting for so long. And it's really frustrating when we try to, address some of our other issues in the state, when this is kind of the crux of it all. And if we can do this and do it well, we can really have an Ohio that is, for generations to come, a place that can really, anyone can live, work, and raise a family, which is something, no matter your party, we should all want. So starting with the base cost, something that was completely a shock to me currently in how we fund, per pupil amount in that base cost, it's $6,020. And no one in the state can tell you where that number comes from. What happens, or what was happening, and what kind of got the state in trouble with the Supreme Court is education is one of the biggest pies of the state budget. And they were funding all of the other pieces, our correctional institutions, Medicaid, and what was left over is what they were using for education and dividing that amongst the students. So it wasn't based on actually what it costs to educate a student. And that is very, to me, it was shocking and frustrating, as, education is the great equalizer, one of the most important things we could be doing, and is a duty, actually, as I've mentioned multiple times in our Constitution, we have these arbitrary numbers. And so what we are now doing is, through research and study that, took those 3 years, each school district now will get their own individual base costs based on the needs of that school district and what it actually costs to educate a student. That has never happened before. And I think a common misconception when we're talking about funding is that within this base cost, 75% of that goes directly to the student. That is something I've heard a lot with when I'm out in my community talking about the need for levies. There's this idea of administrative bloat, and within this, we're addressing the concerns that the number one, part of any funding formula needs to be student-centered, and that's what this plan is. Another important shift is that we are now including income into that local share. So you recall that over lines of property taxes, we're putting 60% of property, 40% of income to actually derive a more fair and adequate and accurate what that community can actually contribute in this relationship with the state and local communities. Also, very excitingly, we have, once you have the base costs, there's different categories we put on. If you're economically disadvantaged, if you're English language learner, if you have special needs, if you're gifted, we are funding studies to get at what it means to be economically disadvantaged and what that costs. And those studies have already been implemented last General Assembly. They're going to come due in the next few, I think in a year and a half. So this is it's not a perfect bill, but it's a good start. And the hope is once we get this information coming in, we can again look at, this is what it cost in Ohio for these students, and we need to find a way to pay for that. Economically disadvantaged, important that we know that in Ohio, I've not done the best in actually addressing the needs of those students and understanding the wraparound services and the extra needs for those school districts, especially when there's a high concentration of individuals that are economically disadvantaged. So there's a 6-year phase-in. It's at this point a $2 billion cost. And we're phasing that in over 6 years, hopefully. But it was really important for us in this bill to say that in any new money that comes in that economically disadvantaged, the money that comes to that needs to be our first priority, because we know that we're underfunding. We are giving an extra $150 per economically disadvantaged on top of what we're already giving. I will be very upfront. I think it needs, going down the road, once we have that study, it will more than likely be higher than that. But at least we can, everything in this plan is evidence-based and driven by data in Ohio. And I hope that we get to that point where, again, the goal is, I think, for everyone, is that any student, no matter their zip code, can get an adequate education and live the life that they want. And lastly, before I would love to focus on your guys' questions and what you guys care about. But anyone that is familiar with school funding, and one of the more controversial ways that we currently fund it is that the money goes to the school district in which the student lives and not where the school that they're attending. And what is happening is a school district is funded by X amount of dollars through our current formula. And then there's these deductions. So if that student decides to go to a charter school or an open enrollment school, that public school district is the conduit for that money. But what is happening, because we've had all these Band-Aid fixes, is that we have these caps and these guarantees that in many cases we are giving a public school the money, and the public school has to give that to the charter school, and it's actually more money that they received for that. And it's caused a lot of, and that of course filters into politics. And when you're pitting charter schools against public schools in this very nasty way, that has accumulated into a lot of, I think, issues. And what is very exciting is that we have both supports from those schools on this bill, because we are taking that very bad accounting, and it really doesn't make a lot of sense as to why you would do that. We are funding students where they're educated, and they are separated out. They have direct funding, and it's very exciting, because I think when we can start with the premise that this is about the students and what are we giving enough money to educate students where they want to go, and this bill does that. In conclusion, I'm just so honored to be on this bill. It is, no easy feat. There's a reason this hasn't gotten accomplished in 24 years, and it's through groups like the League of Women Voters and, spreading this message. It is the most important thing we can do. And I do, just before I turn it over, before I got into, school funding, one of the top things I spent my time doing in the last General Assembly was working on voting issues and voting access, and pushing for fair reforms and calling out some of the issues that I saw when it came to that. And I think that I bring that up because I think one of the reasons I would attribute to why we haven't seen such a issue like school funding that has bipartisan support, I would say most Ohioans understand that it's an issue and want that, is because of non-competitive districts, redistricting reform, not having access to the ballot box in the same way as everyone else. And so I appreciate, again, your guys' work on that, because when we have people paying attention, when we have people feeling as though that their voice matters, their vote counts, that's how we see real change. And that's how we can get big issues like this over the finish line, hopefully sooner than 24 years. And so I'd be happy to talk about, I still have other bills, automatic voter registration, a whole slew of things that I'm reintroducing that I haven't yet. And with that, I will turn it over. And again, I appreciate everyone participating today.
Thank you so much for that. Yes, we have had a lot of questions flooding in because you've touched on three major areas of interest for all of our viewers here: education, voting rights, and redistricting. So let me first start by following up with some of the questions specifically about education that you mentioned. People are asking, last time this came close, but then didn't happen in the last session. So people are concerned that there might be impediments this time. What impediments do you see? And then what can people on this call do to help ensure that the bill passes?
Thank you so much for that question. I'm going to be honest, there is, as always, competing views into how we should address this problem. I will say that it is our goal, me and my joint sponsor, and, it's helpful when this is, the person who held this bill last time becomes the speaker. And so I'm very confident that we can get this out of the House, and hopefully in that same, bipartisan fashion, with, a very small amount of people opposing it. And I think that we're there. It is our goal now. We're looking at a possible sub-bill in finance this week. And that is, so it's separate out of the budget, and it's House Bill 1. And the point of that is to, hopefully if we can get this done before break, send it over to the Senate, because one of their main complaints last time, the work was done. I sat on finance, there was over 9 hearings, probably 100 hours of testimony. We vetted this bill, and by the time it got to them, they had a matter of, maybe 2 months. And so we want to give the due diligence of the Senate, the time on a very important bill, and they should vet and they should go through that. But it's still our goal to try to connect this to the budget, and that's the timeline we're working with. And that's kind of where we got into some, not trouble, but we're, if we don't get it done, we have a constitutional deadline of funding our state budget by July 1st. And, right now, no school district is on the funding formula. So not one, because last budget, we just said, whatever you're getting last time, that's what we're going to give you. And so, and the governor didn't touch this issue because he knew that the legislature was working on the funding formula. So it is my goal is to connect this to that budget, to have that pressure, because if we don't get in there, then it becomes, we're already sending money out, it's hard to pull that back. And, it would just be kind of, this is the structure for hopefully next budget cycle. And so that's, time is of the essence. And this is, kind of coming to this point. And so I would say what you guys can help is, as always, one, doing events like this, allowing me to speak and to be, it's a complicated bill. It is, the more I learn, the more I'm like, this is, very complicated, but high level of understanding what we're trying to do here and being able to talk about that to our friends and families. And, as always, sometimes I know it can be daunting, or feel like it doesn't move lawmakers is the calls and the emails, but it does. It's, it's a high, you have to do it a lot to yield maybe 1 or 2 members that were on the cusp, but it does matter. And I would say that, of course, in the House, getting those people across Ohio and connecting them, but also in the Senate, where we know that, they haven't had the bill as much. And, there is maybe some of the concerns we're hearing publicly are coming from the Senate. So, we're trying to hurry up and get it done over there. And I would say anything you guys can do to put that pressure on our senators and to see where they're at, what, their plan is. And, we're happy, it is our goal to get this over the finish line. And in the legislative process, that means compromise. And, the more that we could share and show that this is, the plan we need to do would be we'd all be very grateful and appreciative for that work.
Okay, so I'm hearing everybody that call your representatives, and equally and perhaps even more importantly, call your senators, your state senators. Now, you also raised budgetary issues, which I will get to in a minute, but I have one further question regarding the plan in House Bill 1. There's some concern, as you know, about the Ed Choice vouchers, and the question is, the people were listening to your description of how it would change, and someone asked for clarification. Does this mean there'll be separate funding streams for public and private systems so that we will no longer be taking from a particular public school to fund the children who are going to private school?
Yes, thank you for that question. And it is complicated. So yes, we are going to where funding students where they're being educated. And so that is how we're going to calculate that and how that school gets that money directly. However, there is a nuance here in terms of the charter school community was a little nervous about if you take away this deduction, because right now it's all entangled within the public schools, and you just have community schools, which are charter schools, and these line items that a governor or, who was not favorable of charter schools could line item veto them. And so I said that's would be disastrous. I mean, whatever you think about charter schools or community schools, to me, it's it's about funding students where they're at. And so that's something that we're working on the sub bill, one of the changes from 305 to House Bill 1 and the sub bill coming out, hopefully in finance this week, that we're putting it in the same line item. So if you're a public school student, you get that money. It's in that same line item now, and it's through the students. And in terms of the vouchers, I do believe we are also having its own line item for that, which again goes into, why we have such, these issues that aren't necessarily, there's obviously competition in this, but it's very toxic right now, and to the point where we're not getting anything done. So yes, we're going to direct funding of these things, but there's some kind of nuances we're working out just to make people feel a little bit more comfortable, but getting away from the deductions is one of the crowning, I think, achievements of this bill that will put, education policy in a different limelight and be more student focused.
Thank you. Okay, so the other message then for everyone watching is watch what happens, because you've introduced House Bill 1, but there's a long way to go, and
yes,
there will be adjustments and changes. Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Regarding the budget specifically, there's been a question about, will there be a specific recommendation for a particular funding amount in the new budget?
Yes, so we're still working on that. So House Bill 1 in the changes I've described, and there's a few others that will be in the sub bill, and it could still change. And the goal is to hopefully get it out of finance and on the House this week or maybe the week after. And that is, again, to get the policy over to the Senate. And so once we roll this into the budget, that's when we kind of discuss. And so right now, we have a 6-year phase in. It's going to cost an extra $2 billion. And that seems like a lot of money. But what I like to push back, and a lot of my colleagues that address the issue of how we're funding this, on average, every biennium, we're about 330, I'm going to estimate the numbers, adding to the budget of education. And so it's really on the trajectory. This bill over 6 years is actually in line with what we've been doing already. The difference is that we're actually putting, there's evidence behind this, and we're putting the money where it is needed. And then there's these studies that will come out and address, if we are underfunding, economically disadvantaged. And, that is another factor we have to play into. But getting this base funding, it's really not a crazy ask, especially over that 6-year period. And so once we kind of roll it into the budget, which hasn't happened yet, we will see about how much we're going to put into the funding of this first iteration. There's a lot, if, for whatever reason, talking with OBM, the Ohio budget director, we actually are in a very good spot for Ohio, and that's really counterproductive for being in a pandemic. And it's a lot due to the help we are going to be receiving from the federal government. And it's important to say, none of the federal government money, which is one-time money, is in this. This is, we want a sustainable streams that are going to funding this. So I don't have an exact answer at this moment, but we will, once that is rolled into the budget, address that. And if we can, we've talked about, maybe we can shorten that phase-in period to 4 years. And if that's something, we know that the time is now, there's term limits, and we have to have the people that were working on this, getting this across the finish line into that full funding, where we can finally say that we have an adequate and fair school funding, and that will happen at the end of the 6-year phase-in, or maybe 4.
That's okay. Thank you very much. I just want to remind everyone that interest in this, we do have a webinar tomorrow specifically on school funding, where you have another opportunity to ask Representative Sweeney some questions. And we'll get details on that at the end of our session today. Another budgetary point that has come up is concerns childcare centers, we got a question early on. Are childcare centers on the agenda for funding? There's concern about making them affordable for middle and lower income families. Is that part of the budget process this year?
Yes, and I can't speak in depth about that. It's probably in the Health and Human Services Committee. I know it's a huge issue that, addressing, and, the step up to quality and the 3-star system, and making sure that, there is access and affordability. And so there is, I signed on to an amendment to increase the eligibility of, maybe it's at 1/3, the governor maybe said 130% of the poverty line, but that it's only a few thousand students that would be newly qualified. We know in Cleveland, where I represent, we have which is something I was not aware of until recently, the highest portion of children in poverty. That's something that we should all, that when we have statistics like that in our state, and of course, Cleveland's not the only state that has, or city that has that issue, that's a direct connection. And we know the earlier we get in, having that care and preschool, I'm conflating the two, it's important, and, allowing, moms and dads to work. And so I believe the governor's budget helped a little bit, but I'm pushing for an increase in that, and also giving resources to childcare centers to allow them to get to that point. You can't just have this mandate. Here you go. These are your new qualifications. We're going to have all these new people eligible to make it more affordable, without allowing those care centers to have the resources to get there, which is such an important part of our entire economy.
Okay, thank you very much. Now we're going to turn to another important interest of the League of Women Voters, which is, of course, voting rights. What are your impressions about how voting went in the most recent election? How do you think Ohio can improve the way we vote, particularly in light of challenges that we've seen with voter turnout? Overall, it was high, but in certain parts of the state, in certain municipal areas, it was surprisingly low.
Thank you for that. Yes, I mean, we had, through a lot of work of groups like yours, of educating and understanding and having, in our primary, access to mail-in voting, an increase of that, which was really exciting, and getting voters more acquainted with the different options we have in Ohio. And that took a lot of work from a lot of good groups. And we had, more people register than ever before, but, I wouldn't say that we did everything in Ohio to ensure that everyone in a global pandemic had access to vote. And something to me that will always boggle my mind is this issue with the drop boxes. I just couldn't believe that a metal box could be so controversial when we are, talking about access to their mailboxes. I mean, that's all we are doing. And the fact that in Cleveland, our Board of Elections said, okay, we can't have the mailboxes. It needs to be actual staff. They said, we're going to take our staff and have them at libraries in certain portions of the county, and they're going to be collecting that. And that got shot down. And to me, that's just nonsense. It is not about, in the Dropbox issue, I actually, before it became controversial and President Trump said anything, I actually had a Republican willing to drop it with me. And as soon as it became this hot button issue, no one would touch it. And it's just frustrating because it's not just, in a city, or, in Cleveland, we have, 1 million voters or something close to that. In Vinton County, 12,000, and we have the same Dropbox. When people, you mean that too many was the only way, voting by mail was the only way they were going to participate, is ridiculous. And so that is something, one of the biggest things you can change. To me, it's also in the rural areas for those drop boxes. They have to, they don't have the same highway systems. It takes longer to get across the county, depending on that. It actually benefits rural areas. It's not just this Democratic strongholds are going to be the ones, because anytime you talk about voting, it's always has these underlyings. This is good for Republicans. This is good for Democrats. And to me, drop boxes, I don't think it would change that much. Besides, not having them is, definitely, I think, more disproportionate to Cleveland and to my county, which made me very passionate about it enough to actually drop the bill and to keep this conversation up. So I'd love for everyone to look at that and to urge support. Another big thing that really just makes me trying to find the word for it, upset and disappointed in Ohio. It's good. We have a lot of good things we've done, but we can't just say, we've done enough when there's all these other things on the table. So I'm not trying to take away from the good things we have, but with automatic voter registration and purging, Ohio is the most, if not the one or two most purged state. And this is the process in Ohio of removing voters who haven't voted in a certain time frame. And so I personally believe that people have the right not to vote and you shouldn't be removed from the rolls for that. However, irregardless of that, we have seen, and it's been more evident than the past two purges we went through, is that not only are we removing voters for, who haven't voted in 6 years, but we've found that the process we're doing it is riddled with errors, and that we're removing eligible people who have voted in every election. And, when I start talking to some of my Republican counterparts, or it's not happening. And there are some counties where it's mostly Trump voters in Republican counties that are being removed who vote every election because the system is just riddled with errors. I know, the dispatch, I found an error with vendors the vendors that they were using were something with the software. It was just arbitrarily removing people. My office found an error that people that were moved within a county should have been saved, and they were on the list to be removed that was sent to the entire state. And to me, this idea that, we shouldn't be doing this in the first place, but we are now aware that we have, and how long has this been happening? Because to Secretary LaRose's credit, he was the first Secretary of State to open the list. And that's how we were able to find a lot of these errors and to do some of that legwork. But to me, it's not just about being transparent. If you don't have accountability with what you find when you open up, state government, open up these lists, it doesn't mean anything. And so that is something I'm very passionate about. And I, again, will give Secretary Lowe's credit. We have disagreed on this purge issue, but we both agree on the solution, which is automatic voter registration, which would change the way, actually there's already a law in motor voter federal law that when you go to certain state agencies like the department or BMVs, that they have to ask you, are you registered to vote? And so all this does, this simple change of being an opt-in system to an opt-out, saying if you're providing all the information, the transaction is we're registering, or we see you've moved, we're going to update your registration. Is that okay? And they can still have the option, if someone just doesn't want to be registered, they can still have that for whatever reason. Most people don't care. And right now we have about 1 million people not registered on top of, I think 500,000 people removed from the rolls last time. So, but it'd be very unlikely if we move to this opt-out instead of opt-in, that anyone within that 6-year period that would be flagged for this purge would never interact with a state agency. So they would never be asked that question, and it would really make this purge process moot. And sorry, I'm so passionate about this and I apologize, but it's just so important to me because it's not Republican Democratic when we're talking about the most fundamental right, the right to vote. That's what it's based on. And we know that people being removed, I just can't believe that more people aren't up in arms in the legislature. And I'm really hoping that, we've had bipartisan policies, the secretary's been out with that. And I'm looking forward to continuing to push that into the right direction to give confidence to all voters that if you want to vote on election day, you can.
Thank you. Yes, certainly the League is all in on more drop boxes, and we agree that it helps rural areas as much as urban areas where people might lack adequate transportation to get to the one drop box. We're all in for voter verified for non-voting, which of course is ridiculous because it's all the time. And so further questions on this, are you
Catherine, I think you're having troubles.
Yeah, I think I am too. I just saw the unstable. Am I back to stability?
Yeah,
I can hear you now.
Okay, good. Thank you. So the question has to do with a proposal to add party designations to judicial elections, particularly on statewide judicial elections. Do you have a position on that?
I do. I'm actually the ranking member of the Government Oversight Committee that is hearing that bill. So I'm very familiar. Of course, everything happens at once and it's just always busy. But on this piece of legislation, the sponsors of it are identifying an issue. And I would like to say that I think there's a better way to address the issue that they're trying to. And so some of the rhetoric we've heard, and so just for the bill would, currently judicial candidates are nonpartisan in general elections. And so this bill is to have judicial designations, R&D, for Supreme Court races and the appellate races. And so my big concern is, okay, if you're concerned about voter information and having that, why wouldn't you put it on all races? Local, municipal, countywide, why should you have that? And then there has been talk of actually exempting the Chief Justice for the Supreme Court. So you would have just some of the races, but the Chief Justice race not have that ID. And so I would say that if you really, your issue is about making the voters aware of that party designation, that at the bare minimum, this bill should be inclusive of all judicial candidates. I've never heard a rationale that made sense as to why we'd have these exemptions. It's either they all have it or they don't. The second issue that they are trying to address with this bill is the drop-off of people not voting in judicial races, and they're equating it to not having that party ID. I think that if that is the concern, we can do, I have plenty of ideas on how we can increase voter education. And, we've actually cut some of that line items for a certain board of elections. And so there are issues, in nonpartisan ways, we can educate individuals. And there was actually a study that came out from a nonpartisan group, I'm going to forget it, that said, what do you care about in your judges? And the party ID was at the bottom. It was, are you recommended by the bar? These nonpartisan organizations. And there's a reason. It's not like we just forgot to put the ID on there. The judicial branch is supposed to be nonpartisan. Even when they're campaigning, they can't give their position on abortion or on certain cases. And it's about the confidence of whoever is before that judge can say that that judge, to the best of their ability, without any other influences, is going to make that decision on the facts. And of course, there is influences on philosophy, but that doesn't necessarily equate, that being a Republican or a Democrat. And so we've actually, Chief Justice O'Connor has, who's our Supreme Court now, has for the past 10 years been actually advocating to get rid of partisan primaries, because I will give the sponsors of this bill that it doesn't really make sense that you can run in a Democratic primary and then you don't have that designation on the general. And that makes Ohio a little bit of an outlier. And so, but doing what they're suggesting is not going to make us in line with every other state. I would, if this is an issue, let's talk about getting rid of the partisan primaries and having open primaries. And I think we can all agree that politics are more partisan than ever. I think the last thing we need to do is start having, our judicial candidates have to be more political, have to, participate more than they already are into those processes, and kind of what that does to voter confidence, anyone in the judicial system. And so I am, there is a third hearing this week. There is opposition testimony from, I believe, the Bar Association, the Judicial Conference. And so they're throwing out other proposals. Maybe we expand the term limits on judges so they're not running as often. I mean, because that's what, you shouldn't have to know the outcome just because of someone's, party ID. And yes, that's sometimes how it goes, but we've seen time and time again, especially on our Supreme Court, that that's not always what happens. And my fear is once we politicize more the judicial branch, that's what we're going to get. And that's not good for anyone. So I appreciate that question. And I'm looking forward to hearing the opposition testimony. And if anyone wants to come in and oppose, you can come to the Government Oversight Committee and talk to my office, and we can get you connected with that.
Thank you. And then one last, because we can't have a league event without talking about redistricting. It is coming up. As our viewers know, state legislative districts will be redrawn by the bipartisan committee. Congressional districts, though, go in the first instance to the General Assembly to vote. So on your end, knowing this won't be happening, perhaps, it's starting, the process is starting, and will be delayed because of the census delays. But what are you hearing now? What are you hearing about how the process will work? Do you think we will end up with maps that are more fair and less gerrymandered? And I am focusing particularly on Congress, because that's where you will have a vote.
Yes. To be honest, not hearing a lot. And this is something that actually Leader Sykes and I, 2 years ago, it's probably this month, 2 years ago, have been starting, because there's a redistricting commission that's not, that actually starts to set up and says, these are the vendors we're going to use, the software, and getting ready for that process. And I know that she had recently called for that. And so that's the first step of, getting, I think it's all, don't quote me on this, I believe it's all leaders of all of the caucuses. So, the Senate president, the speaker, and then the 2 minority leaders, and maybe a few others that will start working on that. And that hasn't convened yet. And I think, pushing for that, that's something, we keep, in the media, even though it's being delayed, that there's so much work that needs to be done before that. And I've been asking, so one of the reasons why I asked to be on government oversight is that there is a chance that it goes through that committee. Who knows? I couldn't get a straight answer, but in the Senate Government Oversight and Elections Committee. And so that to me made the most sense as to where this would possibly be worked through from. They can also create their own special committee that actually does that and reports back. So I've been hounding some of my Republican colleagues for more information on that, because I'm very excited. And I think that now more than ever, some of the new tools we have of access to, just groups, anyone can now draw their maps and be more involved in the process. The people being involved is going to be the only reason why we get to that actual fair districts, and hopefully the full 10-year maps and not going through this 4-year. But it is the General Assembly and it is politics. So I would say that that's not on the table, but I would just say that it is the league, everyone on this call participating, watching, and, and so it's going to be one of my top priorities when we go through this process, that we are including everyone across the state and explaining why this is the most important thing that we could be doing and be watching.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for your time today. And since it's such a beautiful day, I did promise we would be done by 12:45. So we're zooming in, but I think everyone, were this a live event, you would be getting a big round of applause. So thank you for coming here. It's been wonderfully informative. For our audience, we are sharing now on the screen Representative Sweeney's contact information. I know I didn't get to everybody's questions. Feel free to reach out to her and ask her directly, because she is here and always willing and welcoming to hear input from the constituents. Coming up tomorrow, as previously announced, next slide, please, drum roll. Yes, equitable public school funding, why it matters and how to get there, a full hour plus on school funding issues. So if that is your particular concern, please tune in tomorrow, where Representative Sweeney will also be speaking. And then a couple of other future events are there on your screen about redistricting. We always encourage our viewers to join the league. Join us in our activism. We're working hard to make democracy better in Ohio. And in particular, it is our 100th year I believe our next slide, yes, reminds everyone, we've been around for a long time. We hope to be around for 100 years more. Help ensure that by joining our League of Ohio Centennial Club. So with that brief closing pitch, I thank everyone for attending, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this wonderful day. And Representative Sweeney has put in the chat, please do contact her with your comments, your suggestions, and your questions. Thank you very much to everybody who participated.